It wasn't poison, Tiffany said, stirring her latte with a sickeningly casual air. Poison is so messy. No, what I used on David was far more elegant, sophisticated. He never felt a thing, just drifted off to sleep and never woke up. The perfect, tragic story of a young man with a bad heart. I stared at her across the small table in the middle of a bustling Starbucks, the smell of coffee and baked goods thick in the air. My hand was trembling beneath the table, but I kept my voice steady. And the baby? Your son. She sighed, a sound of pure annoyance, as if I'd brought up a tedious errand. That baby, Leo, was a loose end, a defect. He would have inherited David's money, and his awful genetic disorder would have been terrible for my brand. Leaving him at the fire station was almost charitable. He was supposed to freeze. It would have been quicker, cleaner. She leaned in, her voice a conspiratorial whisper, a smug smile playing on her lips. But you're a businesswoman, Carol. You get it. So here's the deal. She never got to finish her sentence. A man in a gray hoodie at the next table slowly stood up. He wasn't a student or a remote worker. He was the lead detective on my son's case, and the quiet click of the handcuffs he snapped onto Tiffany's wrist echoed louder than any gunshot. Seeing her perfect, curated world shatter in public wasn't the beginning of the story, it was the destination. To understand the long, brutal road that brought us to that moment, and the tiny, innocent life I had to save along the way, we have to go back. Back to the coldest night of the year, and a cardboard box left outside a fire station door. That fire station door was the only thing separating the desperate from the warm. On the coldest nights in November, I'd volunteer at Station 4, helping with their warm welcome program. It wasn't much, just a few cots, a pot of coffee that always tasted a little burnt, and a place to get out of the wind that whipped off Lake Michigan. It was a good way to feel useful, to fill the cavernous silence that had become my life since my son, David, had passed. The old building groaned as the wind hit it, and the radiator in the corner hissed like a sleeping snake. I was pouring a cup of coffee for a man whose hands were raw from the cold when the alarm went off. It wasn't the roaring siren of a 4-alarm fire. It was a sharp, clinical chime, the one they used for medical calls or, in this case, a discovery. A young firefighter, barely 25, named Jimmy, burst in from the back entrance, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. There's a box, he stammered, out back, by the dumpsters. The fire station was a designated safe haven. A parent could leave a newborn in a special bassinet right inside the main door, no questions asked, anonymity and safety guaranteed. But by the dumpsters? That wasn't a desperate plea for help. That was a disposal. Jimmy brought it in. A standard cardboard shipping box, sealed with packing tape. My heart hammered against my ribs. The room went silent, save for the hiss of the radiator. He took out a utility knife and sliced through the tape. When he lifted the flaps, a collective gasp sucked the air from the room. There, nestled in a dirty towel, was a baby. So small, so still, his skin had a bluish, waxy sheen. His tiny lips were the color of a stormy sky. He wasn't moving. "Oh, God," one of the young paramedics whispered, her hands flying to her mouth. "He's gone." Her partner fumbled for his radio, his voice cracking. "We have a code blue, infant. Looks like a DOA." But they were wrong. My mind, which for 6 months had been a fog of grief, suddenly became crystal clear. 40 years of screaming newborns, frantic parents, and the relentless beep of NICU monitors snapped into focus. My body moved before I even gave it permission. "Give him to me," I said. My voice wasn't a request. It was a command. It was the voice I used when a doctor was making a mistake, the voice that had earned me the nickname the General for 4 decades. The young paramedic, startled, looked at me, a 63-year-old woman in a worn cardigan. "Ma'am, you need to step back." "I was head pediatric nurse at St. Jude's for 40 years, I said, my eyes locked on the baby. "His airway might be compromised. He's in hypothermic shock, not cardiac arrest. Now, give him to me." There was no more argument. He placed the tiny, cold bundle into my waiting arms. He weighed nothing. I ripped off my own thick wool cardigan and wrapped him in it, my hands working on pure muscle memory. I tilted his head back, my pinky finger gently clearing his mouth. I placed my ear to his chest. There it was, a heartbeat, faint, fluttery, like a trapped bird's wing. but it was there. "He's alive!" I barked. "Get me warm saline now!" and a radiant warmer. The paramedics, shocked out of their paralysis, scrambled to follow my orders. As I held him, rubbing his tiny back to create friction and warmth, my thumb brushed against the side of his neck, just below his ear. I felt it before I saw it, a patch of skin that was subtly rough, textured. My blood turned to ice. My hands trembled as I pulled back the collar of my cardigan. There, stark against his pale skin, was the rash. It wasn't angry or red. It was a faint, lacy pattern, like a delicate, deathly web. "No," my mind screamed. "It can't be. Not this." It was galactosemia, a 1 in a million hereditary metabolic disorder. A baby born with it couldn't process the sugars in milk. To them, a mother's milk, the very thing meant to give life, was a poison. It was rare, but I'd seen it twice in my career, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it ran in my family. My grandmother's sister had lost 2 children to it before they even had a name for the disease. It was our family's ghost, a genetic curse whispered about at holidays. My son, David, had been tested for it at birth. He was a carrier. He couldn't get it, but he could pass it on. I looked down at the tiny face, seeing for the first time the faint echo of my son's chin, the same dark wisps of hair. This baby, this discarded child left to die in the cold, was my grandson. The paramedics were back, their efficiency restored. They took him from my arms, placing him under the warmer, their hands now sure and steady. One of them looked at me, his eyes wide with a newfound respect. "Ma'am," he said, "you saved his life. How did you know what to do?" I just shook my head, my throat too tight to speak. The truth was lodged there like a shard of glass. I couldn't tell them that I recognized my own blood. I couldn't tell them that the monster who had left this baby to die wasn't some terrified, homeless teenager, but someone much, much closer to home. As they wheeled the incubator out to the waiting ambulance, its lights painting the station in strobes of red and white, I stood by the window. The cold from the glass seeped into my skin, but it was nothing compared to the frozen certainty settling deep in my soul. Tiffany, my perfect grieving daughter-in-law, had been lying about everything, and I finally understood that my son hadn't just died. He had been erased. To erase someone, you have to control their story, and Tiffany, I was beginning to realize, was a master storyteller. I drove to her house the next morning, the tidy suburban colonial she and David had bought a year before he died. The sky was a flat, unforgiving gray. My hands were clenched so tightly on the steering wheel my knuckles were white. I didn't have a plan, not really. I just needed to see her face. I needed to look into her eyes and see if there was a soul in there. The house was immaculate, as always. Everything was white or a soft shade of beige, like the inside of a seashell. It wasn't a home. It was a stage, a backdrop for her carefully curated online life. I found her in the living room, which was flooded with the artificial daylight of 2 large ring lights. Her phone was mounted on a tripod. She was in the middle of a live stream. She dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. "It's just, the holidays are the hardest, you know," she said to the phone, her voice thick with a performance of grief. David loved this time of year. He would always say that the first snowfall was like the world getting a fresh start, and now I have to learn how to have a fresh start without him. I stood in the doorway, a ghost in my own son's house. She saw me but only gave a small, sad smile, a gesture meant for her audience, incorporating me into her scene as the brave, grieving mother-in-law. "Every day is a struggle," she continued, her gaze fixed on the phone's camera, "but I draw strength from the love we shared. He was such a dreamer, always pushing himself to be better, to provide for our future." As she spoke the word provide, the sterile white room dissolved around me. I was suddenly 20 years younger, standing in the harsh light of the street. Jude's nurse's station at 3 in the morning. The air smelled of antiseptic and stale coffee. My feet ached with a deep, burning throb from being on them for 16 hours straight. I was picking up a double shift again because David's tuition payment was due. I remembered the fierce, almost painful wave of love and pride I felt when I pinned the receipt to the corkboard above our kitchen table. That was providing. That was the reality of my son's dream, built not on hashtags and sponsored posts, but on a mother's aching feet and unwavering belief. I blinked, and the memory vanished. Tiffany was now holding up a framed photo of David. It was a professional shot, one I'd never liked. He looked stiff, a stranger in a suit. "He was my rock," she whispered. "And even though he's gone, his love is a legacy that I will carry forever. Thank you all for your support. Your messages mean the world." She blew a delicate kiss to the camera and ended the stream. The ring lights went dark, and the room instantly felt colder, the performance over. "Carol," she said, her voice now crisp and businesslike. "I didn't hear you come in." I knocked. She began tidying up, unplugging the lights. "You know, you really should call first. Live streams are a big part of my healing process. My community gives me so much strength." "I was at the fire station last night," I said, my voice flat. "A baby was abandoned, left out in the cold." She didn't stop coiling a cord. "Oh? That's just awful. Some people are just terrible." There was no flicker of emotion in her eyes, no curiosity, nothing. It was like I had commented on the weather. She was a black hole for empathy. "They think he'll live." I pressed on. "A newborn. Can you imagine? What kind of person does that?" She finally looked at me, a flicker of annoyance in her eyes. It wasn't about the baby, it was about me, standing in her perfect house, bringing my ugly reality into her curated world. "Look, Carol, I know you're lonely, especially since David, but I'm really not in a place to take on the world's tragedies right now. I'm focusing on my own healing." She placed her phone on the marble countertop. The small clink was the only sound in the room. My son had married a void. A beautiful, charming, perfectly packaged void. And I knew, standing there in the artificial chill of that house, that this void had swallowed him whole. And that somewhere, in a hospital incubator across town, was the secret she thought she had buried in the cold. I had to prove it. Not just for the baby, but for David. I had to find his story, the one she had tried so hard to erase, and bring it back into the light. Bringing a story back into the light meant finding a truth she couldn't control. That night, I sat in my small den, the one David used to call Mission Control because of all the books and papers. The only light came from the screen of my old laptop. My mind kept replaying Tiffany's perfect performance, the casual way she dismissed the news of a dying baby. It wasn't just a lack of empathy, it was the calm confidence of someone who believes they've gotten away with something. My son was a planner, an organizer. He loved technology, not for the flash, but for its ability to create order. He was the one who insisted on setting up a shared family cloud account years ago. "For all our photos, Mom," he'd said, showing me how it worked. "A digital scrapbook, so we never lose anything." We hadn't used it much since he married Tiffany, who preferred her own polished public feeds, but I remembered the login. He had made the password something sentimental, a private joke between us from a childhood fishing trip, Lure Master 78, something Tiffany would never know and never think to ask. My fingers trembled as I typed it in. The screen blinked, and then a mosaic of our lives filled the screen. There was David, age 10, holding up a ridiculously small fish, grinning from ear to ear. There he was at his high school graduation, looking awkward in his cap and gown. Us on the old porch swing, the summer before he left for college. Each photo was a little stab to the heart. This was the real David, the one of scraped knees and bad haircuts, not the stiff mannequin in Tiffany's framed pictures. I scrolled for what felt like an hour, lost in the ghost world of what used to be. I was just about to give up, to chalk my suspicions up to a grieving mother's paranoia, when I saw it. A folder, nested among albums labeled Family Vacation 2018 and Thanksgiving, with a name that seemed out of place, Projects. Curiosity got the better of me. I clicked on it, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't pictures of home renovations or gardening, it was Tiffany. Dozens of photos of her, taken in what looked like their bedroom mirror. In the first few, she was just starting to show. In the next, her stomach was a pronounced, round curve under a sweatshirt. In the last ones, she was enormous, clearly in the final weeks of pregnancy. The digital timestamp in the corner of the last photo was from 3 weeks ago. My mind reeled. 6 months ago, at David's funeral, she had been rail-thin, accepting condolences in a sleek black dress. It was impossible. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. She had hidden an entire pregnancy. She had given birth in secret. And then, a cardboard box by the dumpsters. The pieces were slamming together with the force of a car crash. But why? Why hide it? Why try to get rid of your own child, David's child? Then I noticed another icon in the cloud interface, one I'd never paid attention to before. Synced devices. David's laptop was still connected. I clicked on it, and a drop-down menu appeared. Browser history. I felt like an intruder, violating a sacred privacy, but I had to know. I clicked again. The first few pages were normal. Sports websites, news articles, searches for a new lawnmower. Then I got to the week he died. My blood ran cold. The screen glowed with a list of searches that didn't belong to my son, to the gentle, kind man I had raised. Fast-acting, untraceable heart-stopping drugs. Potassium chloride dosage, undetectable. How to induce arrhythmia. Life insurance payout rules, spouse is suspect. In 20-year decide, in 25 race. And the last one, dated the day before his death, the search that stole the very air from my lungs, legal rights of disinherited spouses in Illinois. I pushed my chair back from the desk so hard it scraped against the hardwood floor. The sound was violent in the silent house. It wasn't a sudden heart condition. It wasn't a tragic accident. It was a meticulously planned execution. She had been searching for a way to kill him while he was searching for a way to write her out of his will. He must have found out about the baby. He must have confronted her, and that had signed his death warrant. I looked at the photos of my son, his smiling face a cruel mockery on the screen next to the evidence of his murder. The grief I had been drowning in for 6 months transformed into something else. It wasn't sorrow anymore. It was rage. Cold, hard, and clear as ice. I took a screenshot of the browser history. I downloaded every single picture from the projects folder onto a thumb drive. I had the truth now. A terrible digital ghost. And I was going to make sure the whole world saw it. Seeing the truth wasn't the same as making others believe it. The next morning, with the thumb drive clutched in my hand like a holy relic, I walked into the local police precinct. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale coffee, disinfectant, and a kind of weary indifference. I sat on a hard plastic chair for nearly an hour, watching officers come and go, their faces set in masks of grim routine. Finally, a man in a rumpled suit called my name. His name was Detective Miller. He was probably in his mid-40s, with tired eyes and a slump to his shoulders that suggested he'd seen it all and wasn't impressed by any of it. He led me to a small, windowless room with a metal table and 2 chairs. It was the kind of room designed to make you feel small and insignificant. "So," he began, leaning back in his chair, which squeaked in protest, "you have some information about your son's death." I laid it all out for him. I told him about the baby, the rare genetic disorder, my suspicions about Tiffany. I tried to keep my voice even, clinical, the way I would when delivering a difficult diagnosis to a family. I didn't want to sound like a hysterical mother. I wanted to sound like the credible witness I was. When I finished, I slid the thumb drive across the cold metal table. "This is the proof," I said. Photos of her pregnancy, and David's browser history from the day before he died. He picked up the drive, turning it over in his fingers as if it were a curious rock. He didn't plug it into his laptop. He didn't even look at it with any real interest. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice laced with a weary patience that was more insulting than outright disbelief. "I understand this is a difficult time. Losing a child. It's the worst thing that can happen to a person. The mind can play tricks, look for patterns, for someone to blame where there's only tragedy." My back stiffened. "This isn't my mind playing tricks, Detective. This is evidence." "Evidence of what, exactly?" he sighed. "That your daughter-in-law, a woman with a public profile, a beloved local influencer, chose not to announce her pregnancy? That's not a crime. And the browser history. Well, people search for strange things. Morbid curiosity. Maybe your son was a fan of crime novels. We can't build a homicide case on a Google search." He searched for how to disinherit a spouse. I shot back. Why would he do that if he wasn't afraid of her? "Marital problems," Miller said with a shrug. "Happens every day. Look, the coroner's report was conclusive. Your son had a congenital heart defect he never knew about. It was a ticking time bomb. It's tragic, but it's not a mystery. Every word was a brick in a wall he was building between me and the truth. He saw a grieving old woman, lost in a fantasy. He didn't see the 40 years of medical training that taught me to recognize patterns, to trust my gut when something was fundamentally wrong. I placed my hands flat on the table. The metal was cold against my palms. "I want you to look at the evidence, detective. That's all I'm asking." He finally gave a long-suffering sigh and plugged the drive into his laptop. He clicked through the photos of Tiffany, his expression unchanging. He glanced at the screenshot of the search history. "Okay," he said, closing the laptop. "I've seen it. I'll log it. But honestly, ma'am, there's nothing here that gives me probable cause to reopen a closed case." He stood up, a clear dismissal. The interview was over. It got worse. 2 days later, a woman from Child Protective Services called me. She wanted to schedule a home visit. "Regarding the abandoned infant," she said, her voice clinical and detached. "We understand you've taken an unusual interest in the case." Her name was Miss Albright. She was young, armed with a clipboard and a series of invasive questions. She walked through my clean, quiet house, as if she were inspecting it for filth. She asked about my income, my mental health history, if I had a support system. I felt like a bug under a microscope. "Why do you feel such a strong connection to this child, Carol?" she asked, sitting on my sofa, the one David and I used to sit on to watch old movies. "I saved his life," I said, my voice tight. "Isn't that enough?" "Sometimes," she said, making a note on her clipboard. "In cases of profound grief, people can form attachments. They might project their feelings about a lost loved one onto a new object. We have to ensure that your interest is in the child's best welfare, and not just fulfilling a need of your own." The insult was so profound, so deeply wounding, I couldn't even form a response. I, who had dedicated my entire life to the welfare of children, was being told I was a risk. I was being told my love was a symptom of a sickness. The system that was supposed to protect that baby in the hospital was now viewing me, his only real protector, as a potential threat. I was alone. The voice of reason I had expected from the law, from the institutions meant to help, was just an echo in an empty room. They weren't going to save my grandson. They were going to lose him in a sea of paperwork and protocols, while his mother, a cold-blooded killer, walked free. As Miss Albright left, handing me a pamphlet on grief counseling, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. If justice was going to be done, I would have to be the one to deliver it, and I would have to be smarter and far more cunning than all of them. Being cunning meant I couldn't use grief as a weapon anymore. Grief had made me invisible, emotional, easy to dismiss. I had to put the grieving mother in a box and lock it. The woman who needed to act now was the one they had all forgotten, Nurse Hayes. The one who knew that every hospital, every system, runs not on justice, but on protocols and budgets, and I knew exactly how to use both. I spent the first day at the local library, not my den. My house was too full of memories. I needed the sterile silence and the anonymous hum of the library's computers. I looked up the lead pediatric specialists at Street, Anthony's, where they had taken the baby. I found him easily. Dr. Marcus Thorne, head of neonatology. Young, ambitious, with several published papers on rare infant conditions. He was exactly the type I knew how to handle. Brilliant, overworked, and always concerned with his department's bottom line. The next step was harder. I went home and stood in my den, staring at the phone. My heart hammered against my ribs. This had to be perfect. One slip, one crack in my voice, and the whole thing would fall apart. I took a deep breath, picturing myself back at the St. Jude's nurses' station, a chart in my hand and a resident asking a stupid question. I channeled the calm, no-nonsense authority I had worn like a uniform for 40 years. Then I dialed the hospital's main line. "Dr. Thorne's office, please," I said, my voice crisp. "This is Carol Hayes calling. I didn't say I was a retired nurse. I didn't say I was a civilian. I just said my name, as if he should know it. Confidence is the best form of camouflage." I was put through to his nurse. "Dr. Thorne is in rounds," she said, her voice harried. "I understand," I said smoothly. "I was just hoping to leave a message regarding the John Doe infant admitted 2 nights ago with suspected galactosemia. I'm a pediatric specialist, retired now, but I still consult on these rare metabolic cases. I just had a quick thought about his long-term care protocol that might be beneficial." The words, consult, protocol, and beneficial were my shield and my sword. They were the language of her world. I could hear the change in her tone, the shift from annoyance to professional courtesy. "One moment, Miss Hayes. Let me see if he has a minute." He picked up on the third ring. "Dr. Thorne." "Doctor," I began, my voice even calmer than I thought possible. "Thank you for taking my call. My name is Carol Hayes. I was the head pediatric nurse at St. Jude's for 40 years. I heard about your galactosemia admission. It's a brilliant diagnosis. You don't see it often." "We were lucky to catch it," he said, a hint of pride in his voice. "The rash was the tell." "How did you hear about the case?" "The grapevine is long in our world, doctor," I said with a small professional chuckle. "I'm calling because I was consulting on a similar case in Wisconsin last year. A John Doe infant, massive long-term costs for the specialized formula. You know how expensive Neocate is. It nearly bankrupted their NICU." "Don't I know it?" he sighed. "We're already having conversations with the hospital administrators about it." This was it, the opening. "Well," I said, leaning forward, my voice dropping into a more confidential tone. "There's a new federal program that the hospital in Wisconsin used. It's a lifesaver. It's called the National Genetic Disorder Grant. It's specifically designed to cover 100% of the nutritional and medical costs for undocumented infants with qualifying rare conditions. Galactosemia is at the top of their list." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, the dollar signs lighting up. I've never heard of it," he said, his interest piqued. "It's new," I lied smoothly. "Still in the pilot phase. They don't advertise it much, but the protocol to apply is very strict. To prevent fraud, they require a full genetic workup of the infant. Not just for the disorder, but a complete DNA profile on file to ensure the child can be tracked for the lifetime of the grant. It's a bit of a bureaucratic headache, but it saves the hospital tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars." I let the silence hang in the air. I had given him a problem, the cost, and I had given him a solution, my fictitious grant. And I had wrapped the key to my own salvation, the DNA test, inside the solution and presented it as a bureaucratic chore. "A full DNA profile," he repeated, thinking it through. "That makes sense from a federal perspective. Do you have a link to this program?" "I don't have it on me, but your hospital's billing department should be able to find it if they search the federal health grant database," I said, knowing full well they would find nothing, but by then it would be too late. "I just wanted to make sure you were aware. It seemed a shame for the hospital to eat that cost if there was another way. A baby like that needs every resource he can get." "Miss Hayes," Dr. Thorne said, his voice now filled with genuine gratitude. "Thank you. This is incredibly helpful. I'll order the workup today. It's the least we can do." "Of course, doctor," I said. "We're all on the same team." I hung up the phone. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely place it back in the cradle. I sank back into my chair, my whole body trembling with the adrenaline of the lie. I had done it. I had used their system, their language, their priorities, and turned them to my own purpose. They would run the test not because a grieving mother asked them to, but because a competent professional gave them a sound, financial reason to do so. The results would take a few days, but I knew what they would say, and when they did, Detective Miller wouldn't be able to dismiss me anymore. The truth was coming. I had just opened the door for it. I had opened the door for the truth. The waiting for it to walk through was a special kind of hell. The next 4 days crawled by. Each hour was a year. I spent most of my time at the hospital, sitting by an incubator in the NICU. They had officially named him John Doe, a placeholder for a life they didn't think would last, but in my heart I called him Leo, for lion, for the ferocious, impossible fight in his tiny, damaged body. I'd watched the steady rise and fall of his chest, a miracle of modern medicine and sheer willpower. I was a fixture in that ward, the quiet old woman in the corner. The nurses learned to leave me be. They probably thought I was just a lonely volunteer. They had no idea I was guarding my entire world. On the 5th day, my phone rang. It was an unknown number from the hospital. My breath hitched. "This is Dr. Thorne." His voice was different. Not grateful, but tight, confused. "We got the results of the genetic workup, Miss Hayes. The DNA profile is complete." He paused. "And I have to say, this is highly unusual. The lab ran a check against the local database, and we found a familial match. To you. I closed my eyes. What kind of match, doctor? A grandparent-grandchild relationship, 99.99% probability. This baby, he's your grandson. There was another pause. Also, my billing department can't find any record of the National Genetic Disorder grant you mentioned. I must have been mistaken about the name, doctor, I said, my voice perfectly calm, though my heart was about to beat its way out of my chest. Thank you for letting me know. I hung up before he could ask another question. This time, when I walked into the police precinct, I didn't wait. I walked straight to the front desk. I need to see Detective Miller. My name is Carol Hayes. I said it with the kind of authority that brooked no argument. He met me in the same small gray room. He still had that weary slump in his shoulders. I didn't say a word. I simply placed the official, sealed lab report from the hospital on the metal table between us. I set my car keys down next to it. The small, sharp clink of the metal was the only sound. He picked up the report, sliced it open with a letter opener, and read. I watched the color drain from his face. The bored, patronizing mask melted away, replaced by a look of dawning shock, and then something else. The focused intensity of a hunter who has finally picked up the scent. He looked up at me, and for the first time, he didn't see a grieving mother. He saw a witness. This gives me what I need, he said, his voice now a low growl. Probable cause. 2 hours later, I was sitting in my car across the street from my son's house. 2 unmarked police cars were parked in the driveway. Detective Miller and 3 other officers were inside, executing a search warrant. It felt profoundly wrong, watching strangers in tactical vests walk through the rooms where David had grown up, their movements efficient and impersonal. They were searching for the ugliness I knew was hiding just beneath the pristine, white and beige surface. After an hour, Miller came out. He walked over to my car and leaned down, speaking through the open window. We found something, he said. He was holding a small evidence bag. Inside was a crumpled receipt. A Target receipt. It was in the bottom of a trash can in the garage, under a bunch of old newspapers, he explained. Dated the night the baby was found. Time-stamped at 9:14 p.m. There are 3 items on it. A roll of extra-strength packing tape, a box of latex gloves, and 1 large, heavy-duty cardboard shipping box. It was a direct hit. A flimsy piece of paper connecting Tiffany directly to the crime. And yet, when Miller explained the next steps back at the station, the cold reality of the law set in. It's good, Carol. It's damn good, he said, pacing in front of the whiteboard in his office. The DNA, the timeline, this receipt, it puts her in the driver's seat. But it's all circumstantial. A good defense attorney will tear it apart. They'll say David bought the box for storage. They'll say she wore the gloves for cleaning. They'll paint you as a vengeful mother-in-law with a grudge. We can arrest her, but a conviction for murder? That's a whole other ballgame. We need more. We need a confession. He stopped pacing and looked at me. And people like this don't just confess. I looked at the whiteboard, at the timeline he had sketched out, connecting the dots of Tiffany's crime. He was right. She wouldn't confess to him. She was too smart, too controlled. But she had one fatal flaw, the flaw of all narcissists. Arrogance. She didn't just need to win, she needed you to know she'd won. She'll confess to me, I said quietly. Miller stopped. What are you talking about? She thinks I'm a fool, I said, leaning forward. A sentimental, grieving old woman. She's not afraid of me. And more than anything else in this world, Tiffany is motivated by greed. Let me meet with her. I'll tell her the police know the baby is David's. I'll tell her I've been named his temporary guardian and that I now control all of David's assets, the assets she killed him for. I looked Miller straight in the eye. I'll offer her a deal, a payoff, a way to get her hands on the money she's owed. She won't be able to resist. And when she thinks she's pulling one over on the sad, stupid old lady, she'll talk, she'll boast. She'll tell me exactly how she did it. The detective stared at me, his expression a mixture of shock and a dawning, grudging respect. It was a crazy, dangerous plan. It meant putting me in a room with a murderer, but we both knew it was the only way. We'll have you wired, he said finally. We'll have a team in place, but Carol, if she gets spooked, we lose her for good. She won't get spooked, I said. The bait wasn't just the money. The bait was me. and it was time to see if the monster would take it. The monster took the bait. I suggested we meet at the Starbucks on Main Street, a place buzzing with the mundane rhythm of everyday life. It was neutral territory, public, and the last place she would expect a trap. Under my gray wool coat, a tiny microphone was taped to my skin, cold and alien against my chest. Every beat of my heart felt like a drum against it, and I prayed the technicians listening in a van down the street couldn't hear my terror. I got there early, chose a small table in the corner, and bought a cup of tea I had no intention of drinking. The air was warm, smelling of roasted coffee beans and steamed milk. Students were hunched over laptops, mothers were trying to negotiate with toddlers over cake pops, business people were taking calls. It was a world of blissful normalcy, and I was about to shatter it. I saw Detective Miller come in, wearing a nondescript gray hoodie and carrying a laptop bag. He didn't look at me. He sat at the table behind me, opened his computer, and became just another face in the crowd. Tiffany arrived exactly on time, a vision in a cream-colored cashmere sweater. She looked radiant, composed, every inch the grieving widow who was bravely moving on. She slid into the chair opposite me, placing her designer bag on the empty seat beside her. "Carol," she said, her voice smooth as silk. "This is a surprise. What's so urgent?" I took a shaky breath, playing my part. "Tiffany, I don't know how to say this." She leaned forward, a look of practiced concern on her face. "Whatever it is, you can tell me." "The police," I said, my voice a near whisper. "They know. They did a DNA test on the baby from the fire station. They know he's David's son." Her mask didn't slip, but I saw it a flicker, a tightening around her eyes so fast that if I hadn't been looking for it, I would have missed it. "That's impossible," she said. "They've been to the house," I continued, letting the lie build. "And the court, because the baby is a minor and David's next of kin, they've made me his temporary guardian." I let that hang in the air for a moment. "Which means, Tiffany, I control his inheritance, all of it." Now her composure cracked. A flash of pure, ugly fury crossed her face before being replaced by a cool, calculating calm. "What do you want, Carol?" "I don't want a scandal," I said, looking down at my teacup, playing the weak, frightened old woman. "David's memory, our family's name. I can't have it dragged through the mud, so I want to make you an offer." I looked up, meeting her gaze. "You tell me everything, the real story, and I'll set up a trust fund for you. A significant one. We handle this privately, you walk away with a share, and this whole nightmare disappears." She stared at me, her mind working, weighing the angles. I could see the condescension in her eyes. She saw a foolish, sentimental woman she could manipulate one last time. A slow, smug smile spread across her lips. It was the smile of a predator that knows the trap has failed and the prey is cornered. She had taken the bait. "You really don't get it, do you?" she said, leaning back in her chair, the picture of relaxed confidence. "You still think David was a saint and I was the wicked wife." She picked up a sugar packet, tapping it on the table. "He found out I was pregnant. He was thrilled. He started talking about turning his office into a nursery, about 529 plans, about our forever. He was trying to build me a cage, Carol, a beautiful suburban cage." She sighed dramatically. "So when he confronted me, I had to accelerate my plan. I needed the insurance money, the freedom. But he threatened to change his will, to leave everything to the future child. He was trying to cut me out." I just stared, my face a mask of horrified fascination, giving her everything she wanted. "It wasn't poison," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, a sick parody of sharing a secret between friends. "Poison is so messy. No, what I used on David was far more elegant, sophisticated. I crushed a few of his father's old beta blockers into his smoothie. With his bad heart, no one would ever question it. He never felt a thing, just drifted off to sleep and never woke up. The perfect, tragic story. And the baby," I whispered, my voice trembling for real this time. "Your son." She rolled her eyes, a gesture of pure annoyance. "That baby Leo was a loose end, a defect. He would have inherited David's money, and that awful genetic disorder would have been terrible for my brand. I couldn't be the mother of a sick child. It's not my narrative. Leaving him at the fire station was almost charitable. He was supposed to freeze. It would have been quicker, cleaner. She leaned in, her smile widening. "But you're a businesswoman, Carol. You get it. This is so much better. You get to play grandma, I get my money, and everyone wins. So here's the deal." She never got to finish her sentence. A man in a gray hoodie at the next table slowly stood up. His chair scraped against the tile floor. Tiffany glanced at him, annoyed at the interruption. The man wasn't a student or a remote worker. He was Detective Miller, and he was holding a pair of handcuffs. "Tiffany Hayes," he said, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the coffee shop buzz. "I think we've heard enough." The color drained from her face. The smug confidence, the predatory gleam in her eyes, it all vanished, replaced by a raw, animal panic. Her eyes darted from Miller to me, and in that split second, she finally understood. She hadn't been talking to a fool. She had been talking to a jury. The quiet, decisive click of the handcuffs snapping onto her wrists echoed louder than any gunshot. The whole Starbucks fell silent. Every phone, every conversation, every transaction stopped. 100 pairs of eyes were on her as Miller pulled her to her feet. Her perfect, curated world had just been shattered in the most public, humiliating way imaginable. And I had been the one to swing the hammer. But I wasn't prepared for the sound it would make. In the deafening silence that followed Tiffany's arrest, the first noise was a single, hesitant clatter as someone dropped a spoon. Then, a collective gasp. Phones, which had been passive props on tables, were suddenly raised, their small red recording lights blinking on one by one. The patrons of the Starbucks were no longer just customers. They were the first witnesses, the first members of a global jury. I watched, feeling strangely detached, as 2 more officers entered and escorted Tiffany out. She didn't scream or fight. The mask was gone, and underneath was something hollow and terrified. The flash of a news photographer's camera through the window was the first lightning strike of the storm that was about to break. By the time I got home, it had already begun. The local news channel had a breaking news banner across the bottom of the screen. Local influencer Tiffany Hayes arrested in connection with husband's death. They used her most popular profile picture, one where she was smiling serenely in a field of wildflowers. The contrast with the footage of her being shoved into the back of a police car was grotesque. I couldn't look away. I sat on my sofa, the one that still held the faint imprint of my son's weight, and watched the digital world tear his killer apart. It was a brutal, terrifying, and deeply satisfying spectacle. Her name was trending on every social media platform. Hashtags were born: #Tiffany the Terrible, #Murderer Mom, #Justice for David. Driven by a morbid need to see it all, I opened my laptop and went to her main social media page, the one where she had performed her grief for millions. Her follower count, which had been a steady 2.3 million, was now a frantic, cascading waterfall of numbers, plummeting in real time. I watched it drop by the 1,000 every few seconds. It was like watching a life drain away, pixel by pixel. And the comments. The comments were a tidal wave of pure vitriol. The thousands of loving messages she had received just days ago were buried under a tsunami of hate. I knew she was fake. Those dead eyes always gave me the creeps. And where considered possible, in fact demanded why. I bought the stupid smoothie maker she recommended. Now I feel sick every time I look at it. Rotten hell, you monster. You and your beige-colored life. Every post, every perfectly filtered photo of her perfect, empty life was now a digital crime scene, swarmed with angry citizens delivering their own verdicts. The community she had so carefully built, the one she claimed gave her so much strength, had turned on her with a ferocity I could never have imagined. They weren't just unfollowing her, they were erasing her. The next morning, the corporate fallout began. One by one, the brands that had filled her home and her bank account scrambled to distance themselves. Evergreen Organics, the baby food company whose products she had promoted as pure love in a jar, released a statement. "We are shocked and appalled by these allegations. Our partnership with Tiffany Hayes has been terminated, effective immediately." Serenity Home, the decor brand that had sponsored her living room makeover, pulled all her content from their website. A high-end athletic wear company she was the face of posted a simple black square with the words, "We stand with victims of domestic violence." They weren't just dropping her, they were acting as if they had been personally betrayed. Her value had never been in who she was, only in the illusion she sold. And now that the illusion was shattered, she was worth less than nothing. She was a liability. I watched it all unfold, not with joy, but with a kind of grim finality. It felt like watching a controlled demolition. The dynamite had been planted, the button had been pushed, and now the useless, dangerous structure was collapsing into a pile of dust and rubble, clearing the ground for something new to be built. There was no pleasure in the destruction, only a profound sense of necessity. The poison had been excised. The last time I saw her before the trial was on the evening news. They had a short clip of her being led down a courthouse hallway. There was no cashmere sweater, no perfect hair. She was in a baggy orange jumpsuit, her face pale and stripped of all its artifice. Her wrists were chained. She looked small, pathetic, and utterly defeated. That image was the final, brutal consequence. The woman who had lived for the camera, who had built a kingdom on a foundation of likes and shares, had finally been captured in a single, unfiltered frame she could never control, and could never, ever delete. That final, unfiltered image of a defeated Tiffany was the end of her story, but it wasn't the end of mine. With the criminal trial over, a new, quieter battle began. This one wouldn't be fought in a Starbucks or on the internet. It would be fought in the hushed, intimidating halls of the family courthouse. Tiffany was gone, but the system remained, a labyrinth of paperwork, evaluations, and judgments that now held my grandson's entire future in its hands. The courtroom was paneled in dark wood that seemed to absorb all the light and hope from the room. I sat on a hard wooden bench, holding a sleeping Leo in my arms. He was 6 months old now, his cheeks chubby, his breathing a soft, rhythmic puff against my neck. I had dressed in my most conservative navy blue suit, the one I used to wear to hospital board meetings, trying to project an image of stability and competence that I did not feel. My insides were a churning sea of anxiety. Across the room sat Miss Albright, the CPS agent, her clipboard now replaced with a formal-looking file. Her expression was neutral, impossible to read. Since my initial humiliating interview with her, she had visited my home once a week. The visits were always clinical, her questions polite but probing, her eyes missing nothing. I always felt like I was failing a test for which I'd never been given the study guide. The judge was a woman named Eleanor Vance, who looked to be in her late 50s. She had sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through the carefully constructed arguments of the lawyers. She reviewed the thick file in front of her, her silence stretching the tension in the room to a breaking point. "Mrs. Hayes," she said finally, her voice clear and authoritative, "I have reviewed your case. It is, to say the least, highly unconventional." She peered at me over the top of her reading glasses. "You are 63 years old. A single woman on a fixed income. You are seeking permanent custody of an infant with a significant lifelong medical condition. You are, yourself, a victim of a violent crime perpetrated by the child's biological mother. On paper, Mrs. Hayes, you present a considerable number of risk factors." Every word was a carefully placed stone on my chest, pressing the air from my lungs. This is it, I thought. This is where they tell me I'm too old, too broken, too much of a risk. I saw Leo's future spooling out in front of me, a series of foster homes, temporary placements, a life defined by a system that would see him as a file number, not a miracle. My arms tightened around him instinctively. "However," the judge continued, "I see that CPS has submitted a final recommendation. Miss Albright, would you please take the stand?" My heart sank. I expected a clinical recitation of those risk factors, a detached summary of why I was an unsuitable guardian, delivered in the neutral, bureaucratic language of social work. Miss Albright walked to the witness stand and was sworn in. She sat, adjusted the microphone, and looked not at the judge but directly at me. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, "when I was first assigned this case, I saw what you see, a list of risk factors. My initial assessment, based on the file, was that while Mrs. Hayes was the child's rescuer, a long-term placement with her would be challenging." She took a breath. I was wrong. The words hung in the silent courtroom. "For the last 3 months," she continued, "I have visited Carol Hayes's home every Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. I came to inspect, to evaluate, to check boxes on a form. But what I witnessed was not something that can be captured on a government document. I saw a bond that was immediate, powerful, and deeply healing for both of them. Tears pricked at my eyes. I fought them back, refusing to cry, refusing to look weak. I saw a woman who hadn't slept through the night in months, but who had the energy to sing to a crying baby at 3 a.m. I saw a retired nurse who had turned her home into a sterile, efficient NICU, managing complex feeding schedules and medications with a skill I have never before seen in a foster placement. But more than that, I saw love, unconditional, fierce, and absolute. She turned her gaze to the judge. The system I work for is designed to find the least risky option. It's about mitigating harm. But once in a great while, we are presented with an opportunity not just to mitigate harm, but to facilitate a miracle. This child has been through an unimaginable trauma. He doesn't need the least risky option. He needs a champion. She looked back at me, and for the first time, I saw not a bureaucrat, but a woman who had learned a lesson. Your Honor, she finished, her voice thick with an emotion she no longer tried to hide. Leo already has his champion. She's sitting right there. My formal recommendation is for the immediate and permanent placement of the child Leo with his grandmother, Carol Hayes. A sob escaped my throat. I couldn't hold it back anymore. It was a sound of grief, of relief, of a battle finally won. The judge looked down at me, and the sternness in her eyes had softened into something that looked like understanding. She picked up her gavel. In light of this powerful testimony, she said, her voice ringing with finality, and in the profound best interest of this child, I agree completely. The gavel struck the wood with a sharp, definitive crack. Custody granted. It was over. The weight of the world, a weight I hadn't even fully realized I was carrying, lifted from my shoulders. The system that had doubted me, that had seen me as a liability, had in the end borne witness to the truth. And in that sterile, intimidating courtroom, a family was not just preserved, it was born. A family was not just preserved, it was born. And the first breath of that new life was the lungful of crisp autumn air I took as I pushed open the heavy courthouse doors and stepped back into the sunlight. Leo was asleep on my shoulder, a warm, solid weight that felt less like a burden and more like an anchor. He had no idea that a woman with a gavel had just rerouted the entire course of his life, and mine. He just knew he was safe. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, so did I. That first year was a blur of moments, a kaleidoscope of firsts that stitched my broken heart back together, one tiny, perfect memory at a time. There was the first real smile, a gummy, glorious grin that lit up his whole face when I walked into the room. The first time he rolled over, an achievement we celebrated with the kind of applause usually reserved for a game-winning touchdown. I watched his first Ohio winter unfold from the nursery window, his dark eyes wide with wonder at the silent, swirling snow. He learned to crawl on the old Persian rug in the living room, the same one David had taken his own first steps on 30 years before. The ghosts in my house were slowly being replaced by the joyful chaos of a new life. The silence I had once found so deafening was filled with the rattle of toys, the babble of a baby discovering his own voice, and the soft music from a plastic mobile spinning above a crib. I wasn't a grieving widow anymore, rattling around in an empty house. I was a mother again. I was Nana. And then, a year to the day after a cardboard box had been left in the cold, my backyard was filled with life. The air smelled of charcoal from the grill and freshly cut grass. Red and blue balloons were tied to the porch railing, bobbing in the gentle summer breeze. A half-dozen neighborhood kids were running through the sprinkler, their shrieks of laughter a kind of music. It was Leo's first birthday party, a celebration not just of his birth, but of his survival, of our survival. Detective Miller, who now insisted I call him Frank, stood by the grill, a beer in one hand and a spatula in the other, arguing with my next-door neighbor about the proper way to sear a burger. He had lost the weary slump in his shoulders. He looked younger, lighter. He was wearing a ridiculous grill master apron that his own kids had given him. And Miss Albright Sarah sat on the porch steps, helping Leo demolish his first-ever piece of birthday cake. He had more chocolate frosting on his face and in his hair than in his mouth, and he was pounding his chubby fists on the high-chair tray in pure, unadulterated bliss. Sarah wasn't holding a clipboard. She was wiping Leo's sticky hands with a napkin, laughing as he grabbed for her nose. She had become a fixture in our lives, a self-appointed aunt who showed up with picture books and stuffed animals, her visits no longer an evaluation but a genuine joy. The people who had once been my obstacles, the stone-faced representatives of a system that had almost failed us, were now my friends. They were my village. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I stepped inside the quiet of the kitchen to answer it. It was a number I didn't recognize. "Is this Carol Hayes?" a woman's voice asked. She sounded exhausted and on the verge of tears. "It is," I said. "My name is Margaret. I got your number from a nurse at Street Anthony's. She said you might be able to help. I'm so sorry to bother you." "It's no bother, Margaret. What's going on?" I leaned against the counter, my eyes still on the party in the yard. "It's my grandson," she choked out. "My daughter. She's not well. She left him with me. He's only 2 months old. I'm 68, Carol. My husband passed last year. CPS is involved, and they're talking about foster care. They look at me like I'm ancient, like I'm incapable. They keep talking about risk factors." I closed my eyes. I knew that phrase. I knew the sting of it, the way it stripped you of your dignity, your history, your competence. "I don't know what to do," she sobbed. "I love him so much, but they're making me feel like I'm not enough." The old me, the pre-Leo me, would have offered sympathy, maybe a few kind words. But the woman I was now, the woman forged in the fire of the last year, did something else. I picked up a pen. "Okay, Margaret, first things first, breathe," I said, my voice calm and steady, the voice of Nurse Hayes taking charge. "Now, get a notebook. I'm going to tell you exactly what you need to do, and exactly what you need to say. We're going to make a plan. The first thing you're going to do Monday morning is file a petition for temporary guardianship. They can't just take him if you have a legal filing in process. Second, we're going to document everything." For 20 minutes, I walked her through it. The legal terms, the forms she needed, the way to speak to a social worker without sounding emotional, the importance of a clean house and a stocked pantry for home visits. I gave her the name of a pro bono family law service. I was giving her a roadmap through the bureaucratic wilderness I had barely survived. I was giving her a fighting chance. When I hung up, my hand was still resting on the counter. I looked out the window at my grandson, who was now safely in Frank's arms, his chocolate-smeared face buried in the detective's neck. I looked at the new family I had built from the rubble of my old one. A new purpose wasn't something you found. It was something you built. You took the broken pieces of your life, the sharpest, most painful shards, and you found a way to put them together to create a shelter for someone else. I wasn't just Leo's grandmother anymore, I was Margaret's hope. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, there were a lot more Margarets out there, and I was ready for their call. I was ready for their call. After I hung up with Margaret, I stood in the quiet of my kitchen for a long time, just listening to the happy noise from the backyard. It was a sound I never thought I'd hear in this house again. For 6 long months after David died, this house had been a tomb. The silence was a physical presence, as heavy and suffocating as a wool blanket in summer. Every room was a museum of a life that was over, every object a painful reminder of what I had lost. The woman who lived in that house was a ghost, just waiting to fade away. I barely recognize her now. Sometimes, late at night, after Leo is asleep and the house settles into a new kind of quiet, a peaceful, breathing quiet, not an empty one, I think about the path that led me here. It started with an act of unimaginable cruelty. A mother's betrayal that logic can't even begin to touch. But what started in darkness didn't end there. It ended with a baby's laugh echoing in the hallway. It ended with a backyard full of friends. It ended with me, a 64-year-old woman, finding a purpose more powerful than the grief that nearly consumed me. I look at Leo sleeping in his crib, in the room that was once his father's. I took down the old rock band posters and the dusty football trophies, but I left one thing on the wall. A framed photo of a 10-year-old David, grinning from ear to ear, holding up a ridiculously small fish from our old fishing spot. Leo has the same grin. He has his father's eyes, his father's spirit. He isn't a replacement for the son I lost. He's a continuation. He is the legacy of David's love, a love so strong it reached out from beyond the grave to make sure his son was safe. Society has a way of putting people in boxes. When you're young, you're the future. When you're middle-aged, you're the backbone. But when you're old, especially an old woman, they put you in the box labeled done. You're supposed to be quiet, take up less space, fade gracefully into the background with your hobbies and your memories. For a while, I believed them. I was living in that box. But Tiffany, in her monstrous arrogance, made a critical mistake. She thought the woman she was dealing with was the one on the label. She never imagined that underneath the grief and the gray hair was a nurse who had spent 40 years fighting for the smallest of lives. She never imagined that a grandmother's love could be the most dangerous weapon in the world. The truth is, strength isn't about how much you can carry. It's about what you do when you're forced to carry the unbearable. You can either let it crush you, or you can build something with it. I took the pain of losing my son, the rage at his killer, the terror of a system that didn't believe me, and I built a fortress around my grandson. And then, I opened the gates of that fortress to help others build their own. So let me ask you, if your world was shattered into a million pieces, if you were left standing in the rubble of the life you knew, would you have the courage to pick up the sharpest, most painful piece and use it to build something new? If this story resonated with you, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What did you think of Tiffany's final shocking confession? We read every comment, and we'd love to hear from you. And for more stories about finding strength in the hardest of times, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you for being here.